Some weddings are remembered because they were beautiful. Some are remembered because of what happened after. The wedding of Prince Emilio and Lady Irenaea was both. The wedding took place on October 23rd in the year 1487 in the big church of St. Alda, a building that had stood in the middle of the kingdom's main city for 250 years. That autumn day, warm golden light came through the tall windows. The people who were there would later find it hard to talk about it without feeling a little uneasy. It was as if they had watched something happen without fully understanding what it was. Prince Emilio was 24 years old. He was the second son of King Rodrigo II, a king who was getting older and more impatient every year. The king had spent most of the last 10 years trying to manage the greedy people at his court and deal with money problems caused by 2 bad harvests in the north. Emilio was not the one who would become king. That was his older brother, Prince Aldrich, 6 years older, serious, and already respected by the royal council. Emilio had always lived in his brother's shadow, not in a sad way, but quietly, the way people do when they are happy to avoid a heavy responsibility. Irenaea was the daughter of Count Valdaro Serrano, a lord from the eastern part of the kingdom whose land sat along the most important trade roads. Her father was not a warm or kind man, but he was very, very smart about planning things. The marriage between his daughter and the younger prince had been arranged secretly over 3 years, not through the royal court like these things were supposed to be done, but through go-betweens whose names were never written down anywhere. This was the first strange thing. Marriages like this were usually open and official, watched over by the royal council. This one was not. The council only found out about the wedding 6 weeks before it happened. The king told them it was already decided. There was no record of anyone arguing about it. Lord Serrano stood near the front of the church during the ceremony. He was dressed in the deep green of his family's colors. His hands were folded in front of him, very still, like a man who had already gotten what he came for. He did not cry the way some fathers do. He just watched carefully, like someone watching the last step of a plan they had spent years building. Also, there was the Queen Mother, Donna Celestina, King Rodrigo's elderly mother, who still had an important place in the court. She was 61 years old. She had survived the death of her husband, the death of a daughter, and a big political crisis that had almost removed her family from power 20 years before. She was not someone who showed her feelings easily. But the people who stood near her in the church that day later said she did not look like someone at a happy celebration. She looked, one servant would say many years later, like a woman watching a fire that had not yet reached the house. The party lasted all through the night. There was music in the great hall and a big feast, which was surprising given that the kingdom was having money problems. Wine, rich food, and hundreds of candles burning through the long October night. Emilio danced with his new wife. People who watched them described it differently depending on when they were asked. Right after the wedding, the descriptions were warm and happy. The prince seemed genuinely happy, in a way that surprised people who knew him as a quiet person. Irenaea was graceful and attentive. The two talked closely together during the quiet moments in a way that showed they were comfortable with each other. A man named Bertoldo, who worked as the prince's secretary, later wrote in an official statement that the prince had laughed 3 real laughs during the feast. Not the fake, polite kind of laugh that was expected at royal events, but real ones. Bertoldo said this had seemed important to him at the time, but he could not explain why. After 3 in the morning, the party began to wind down. Guests said their goodbyes. The prince and his new wife were officially walked to the rooms that had been prepared for them in the east wing of the palace. The rooms had been cleaned, given fresh bed sheets, and scented with herbs. The door to the east wing was closed. 2 guards were posted at the entrance to the hallway, as was the usual custom. The night passed quietly. In the morning, when the servants came to get the rooms ready, they were empty. The bed had been slept in. The candles had burned all the way down. The clothes laid out for the next day were still sitting untouched on a chair. A cup of wine had been poured and left on the small table near the window, almost full. The prince and his new wife were not in the room. They were not in the palace. They were not anywhere anyone could find. The guards at the hallway entrance said they had heard nothing. They were absolutely sure of this, and they stayed sure through many interviews over the following days. No one had walked past them. No door had opened. No sound had come from the rooms. The window in the east room opened onto a narrow ledge above the palace gardens, about 20 feet off the ground. The ledge showed no sign of anyone walking on it. The garden below showed no sign either. There had been a light frost that night, and the groundskeeper found the ground beneath the window perfectly smooth. No one had left through the window. No one had left through the hallway. And yet they were gone. The king was told within an hour. He called in the captain of the palace guard, his chief advisor, Lord Ferrante, who had served the crown for 16 years, and his older son, Prince Aldrich, who arrived looking pale, but very calm. The king sat quietly for a long time. Then he asked one question: "Where is Lord Serrano?" Lord Serrano was found asleep in his guest room. He was woken up and brought to the king's study. Two people described his reaction differently. Lord Ferrante said Serrano looked shocked. His face went pale and he needed to sit down. Prince Aldrich, weeks later, paused for a long moment. He only said that Serrano had been very, very still. A search was ordered. Every room in the palace was searched. The grounds, stables, kitchens, cellars, chapel, all searched before midday. Riders were sent to the city gates to ask if anyone matching the prince's description had passed through. They had not. By evening, the royal council had met in an emergency meeting. By the next morning, news had begun moving through the city. Not announced, not confirmed, but somehow already known, spreading through the streets and the market squares and the taverns. The prince was gone. The new princess was gone. No one knew where. No one knew why. And for a very long time, that was all anyone could say for certain. The weeks that followed were full of confusion, an official kind of confusion that did not sit well alongside the private calculations. The king ordered an investigation led by Lord Ferrante. Over the next 6 months, 3 written reports were produced. Each one carefully listed everything that had been done in the search, the riders sent out, the areas searched, the witnesses questioned, the evidence examined. Each one reached the same conclusion, or rather, the same non-conclusion. Nothing had been found. Nothing could be explained. The disappearance remained, in the official language of the investigation, without resolution. Bertoldo, the prince's secretary, was interviewed 3 times. He was helpful, careful, and clearly upset. He had seen the prince on the morning of the wedding and briefly during the feast. He had not spoken with him after that. He knew of no plans the prince had made, no arrangements, no letters that might suggest the couple had planned to leave. When asked during the 3rd interview whether Prince Emilio had seemed afraid of anything in the weeks before the wedding, Bertoldo thought carefully before answering. He said the prince had seemed less relaxed than usual. There had been moments when he seemed distracted, lost in his own thoughts. Bertoldo had assumed it was just the normal nervousness before getting married. Whether it had been something more, he could not say. Donna Margit, the palace housekeeper, was interviewed once. She gave precise information about the state of the rooms when she had last seen them. She was not asked anything beyond these practical details. She was let go from royal service 6 months later, officially because of her age and health. The 2 guards at the hallway entrance were interviewed many times. They never changed their story. They were later moved to work at a military post 40 miles from the capital. The Queen Mother, Celestina, was never formally interviewed. She was of high enough rank that the investigation could not require her to speak, and she did not offer to. She stayed in her rooms for the first 2 weeks after the disappearance, seeing only her personal attendants and twice Lord Ferrante himself. What was discussed at those meetings was never written down. Prince Aldrich became king 3 years later after his father died from a fever in the winter of 1490. King Rodrigo had never really recovered from losing his younger son. People who cared for him in his final years described a man who had become more and more private, who would sit in long silences, and who in the last months of his life would spend hours sitting in the hallway outside the East Wing rooms where his son had last been seen. He did not talk about Emilio openly. He did not talk about the investigation. In his final months, he asked for the investigation to be officially closed. Lord Ferrante did so. The matter did not disappear from people's minds, it just changed shape. Over the years, the story of the prince and princess who vanished on their wedding night moved from official records into public memory, where time and retelling always add distortions. Some people said the couple had run away, that the marriage had been cover for something real, that Alio and Irenaea had truly loved each other and simply refused to live the limited life that royal marriages demanded. This version was a romantic one, and it had the nice side effect of suggesting both of them were alive somewhere, living quietly, growing old in hiding. It required believing that two people could disappear so completely from a kingdom of that size and never surface. Not a rumor, not a single sighting, not one word. Others said they had been taken by political enemies, by agents of a foreign country, by forces connected to Lord Serrano. Serrano himself died in 1493 from a stroke, with no confession and no documents among his belongings that shed any new light on the matter. His lands passed to a cousin. His household was dissolved. 20 years after the wedding night, the story had become, in the capital city, a kind of legend. Parents told it to children as a warning about how happiness can be fragile. Poets had written it in verse in several different versions, each with a different lesson. The actual facts, the real documented details, had become blurry at the edges, softened by years of retelling into something more like a symbol than a specific event. Then, in the autumn of 1507, 20 years after the wedding, a woodcutter working in the forest of Valden, about 12 miles east of the capital, found something buried beneath the roots of a fallen oak tree. The woodcutter's name was Marco. He was 43 years old, an ordinary man from a small village. He had not understood at first what he had found. The fallen tree's roots had torn up a big section of earth, and within the disturbed ground he noticed something that did not belong. The corner of a wooden box, dark with age and moisture, but clearly made on purpose, planked, jointed, built by someone who knew what they were doing. He dug it out with his hands and the edge of his axe. The box was about 2 feet long and a foot across. When he opened it, he found a cloth-wrapped bundle that had partly rotted away. Inside the cloth were two objects. The first was a ring, gold, set with a pale stone, slightly yellow and see-through, and engraved on the inside with letters that Marco could not read because he had never learned to read. But he was smart enough to know the ring was not ordinary. The second object was a folded piece of old paper, sealed with wax that had cracked but not fully crumbled. The seal showed an image that Marco could not identify, but a man in his village who had once worked as a clerk recognized it immediately. It was the seal of the royal house, the personal seal used by Prince Emilio for his letters. The paper was brought to the capital. It arrived at the court of King Aldrich in the hands of the village clerk, a man named Estevao, who had made the journey himself because he understood, not fully, but correctly, that what he was carrying was not something to hand to just anyone. The king received it in private. What happened in that meeting was not recorded. What was recorded in the court's official books for the following week was a series of royal orders, a new investigation into the forest of Valden and the land around it, the appointment of a judge named Lord Castorio to lead it, and the official reopening of the case that had been closed 17 years before. The ring was confirmed within 2 days by the royal goldsmith. It had belonged to Prince Emilio. The words engraved inside meant, "Until I return." It was a personal ring, not an official one, given to the prince by his mother on his 16th birthday. There was no sensible explanation for how it had ended up buried in a forest 12 miles from the palace. The letter, when it was carefully opened and read by scholars, proved to be something no one had been ready for. It was written in Prince Emilio's own handwriting, confirmed by comparing it with documents kept in the royal archive. It was dated October 23, 1487, the day of the wedding itself. It was addressed to no one by name. It began without any greeting, and what it contained, in the careful, controlled handwriting of a young man who clearly knew someone might one day read it, who was not the person he intended it for, was a record of fear. Not the sudden, immediate fear of someone in physical danger, at least not yet. The fear the letter described was slower, more like a step-by-step understanding. It was the fear of a man who had realized too late that he had walked into something he could not walk back out of. The letter described, carefully but not in a totally hidden way, a conversation the prince said he had overheard about 10 days before the wedding. He did not say exactly where he had overheard it, or exactly who had been speaking, though he used a phrase, "the one who serves the old house," that would later be debated by many scholars. What he had heard, he wrote, was a plan, not a plan for his happiness, a plan for how he would be used. The marriage, the letter suggested, had been arranged not for the good of the kingdom but for a very specific, private purpose to transfer through Irenaea the rights to the eastern trade roads, rights that would otherwise go back to the crown after her father's death since he had no son. By marrying Emilio, the younger prince, the one who would never be king, Lord Serrano had created a situation where those roads would belong, forever, to a branch of the royal family that would never sit on the throne, not the crown, not Aldrich's family, a separate branch that could, in the right circumstances, become a rival power. This, the prince wrote, was what Serrano had wanted. This was the plan he had spent 3 years building through secret negotiations. But the conversation the prince had overheard suggested that someone else had understood this too, and had decided the plan needed to be stopped. The letter ended suddenly. At the bottom of the last page were 3 words that appeared to have been written more quickly than the rest, pressed harder into the page, as though added after a pause, or after a sound from outside the room. The words were, "I trust no one." Lord Castorio's investigation, which took nearly 2 years, was done with a thoroughness that the first investigation had clearly been missing. This was partly because Castorio was a more careful man than Ferrante, and partly because the political situation had changed. The Queen Mother Celestina had died in 1503. Lord Ferrante had retired in 1498 and died the following year. The people who had been closest to the original events were either dead or old enough that the protection of powerful people mattered less to them than the idea of a clear conscience before they died. The investigation began with the forest. The area around the fallen oak was carefully dug up over several weeks. About 40 feet from where the box had been found, under 3 feet of earth and a layer of stone that appeared to have been placed there on purpose, the remains of 2 people were found. Identifying remains after 20 years was not an exact science in those days. There were no tools available to be fully certain, but what could be established was this. One set of remains was male, of a height matching what was recorded about Prince Emilio, a man described in court documents as unusually tall for his time. The other was female, smaller, the bones of someone young. Both had been buried carefully, not quickly covered but laid out with attention, dressed in clothing that had largely rotted but had left enough impression in the clay to suggest fine, high-quality fabric. There was no sign of violence on the bones. This was noted carefully and thought about carefully, and in the end judged to be inconclusive. The absence of visible injury did not rule out causes of death that leave no mark on bones. The scholars offered 3 possible explanations, each heavily qualified, and the investigation continued. It was an elderly woman, a former attendant of the Queen Mother, now living in a convent far from the capital, who gave the testimony that changed everything. Her name was Sister Alberna, and she had been, in 1487, one of the personal attendants who served Celestina in the royal apartments. She was 81 years old when she spoke to Castorio's investigators. She said she gave her testimony willingly, because she had been carrying it for 20 years and the weight of it had become more than she wished to take with her to her grave. She had been awake late on the night of the wedding. Sleeplessness had troubled her since middle age. She was in the narrow servants' hallway that ran behind the Queen Mother's rooms, carrying a candle, when she heard voices through the wall. She had not been trying to listen, but she had heard enough. 2 voices, Celestina's and one other, a man's voice she recognized as Lord Ferrante's. She could not give a full account of everything that was said, but 2 things she was absolutely certain of, because she had heard them clearly and carried them in her memory ever since. The first was Lord Ferrante saying, in a very quiet voice, "It is better for the kingdom. You know this." The second was the Queen Mother's reply, which was also quiet. But Sister Alberna heard it clearly because the walls of that old palace were thin, and the night was completely still. Celestina had said, "When it is done, I want them treated with dignity. "I want that sworn to me." Sister Alberna had gone back to her room. She had told no one. For 20 years, she had said her prayers and kept her silence, understanding, with the particular guilt of someone who had witnessed something and done nothing, that there had been nothing she could have done, and that the truth had already accomplished what it was going to accomplish. She had kept it. She had kept it until she could not keep it any longer. What the investigation eventually concluded was something like this. Lord Serrano's plan, as Prince Emilio had described it in his letter, had been understood by certain people at court not as a useful political arrangement, but as a political threat. Giving authority over the eastern roads to a parallel branch of the royal family would not cause immediate trouble. But it created a structure, a legal structure, that could, over a generation or two, become the starting point for a rival claim, not necessarily to the throne, but to power and influence that operated outside the crown's control. Queen Mother Celestina had spent 40 years watching how power worked. She had seen what parallel claims could become. She had, in her younger years, lived through the crisis that had almost removed her family from the throne, a crisis that had begun, as most such crises do, with something that seemed quite manageable at first. She had made a decision. Whether she made it with grief, or with the cold clarity of a woman who had long stopped confusing feelings with government, is something no document can tell us. Lord Ferrante had the connections to arrange what was arranged. Over 16 years of service, he had built relationships with men who could be trusted to act quietly and then disappear back into ordinary life. The guards at the hallway entrance, their later transfer to a distant military post, now suggesting something other than coincidence. The investigation Ferrante himself had led, which had looked thorough but found nothing. The reports that documented everything except the truth. The letter had been buried, along with the ring, perhaps as a quiet, private gesture of acknowledgement, by someone who was not quite willing to destroy the evidence completely. The investigation never figured out who had buried them. It may have been Ferrante himself in a moment of guilt, or the instinct that truth should not be completely destroyed even when it cannot be allowed to live. It may have been someone else, someone lower down, someone whose name the records never captured. The paper had survived because the box was well made, and the clay soil of the Valden forest was cold and dense. 20 years had not been enough to destroy it completely. 20 years had been enough to bury it beyond any reasonable chance of being found again. Fallen Tree changed that. King Aldrich received the full findings of the investigation. In the winter of 1509, he was 52 years old. He had been king for 19 years. He was, by the accounts of people around him, a fair man, not a warm one, but a fair one, which is perhaps a different kind of achievement for someone in that position. He sat with the report for 3 days before doing anything. What he did, finally, was this. He ordered the remains from the Valden forest to be brought to the capital and given a full royal burial in the Cathedral of St. Alda, with the proper ceremonies for a prince and his wife. The burial was done quietly, without any public announcement, attended only by the court and a small number of clergy. There was no sermon. The king stood at the grave and did not speak and did not cry. Those who watched him said later that he looked, for the entire ceremony, like a man settling a very old debt. He made no public statement about the investigation's findings. He ordered no official document. The investigation's reports were placed in the Royal Archive, where they would stay, sealed, for another 60 years, until a historian working on a general account of the dynasty found them and understood what they were. Whether the king's silence was a kind of dishonesty, a kind of mercy, or simply the practical understanding that there was nothing to be done, that the people responsible were dead, that the kingdom could not handle another crisis, that the truth, once known in the right rooms, had accomplished the only justice that was available, is a question the documents leave open. History records what people did. It is much less reliable on the question of why. The forest of Valden is still there. The oak that fell in 1507 rotted over the centuries, and the earth closed over the place where it had stood, and the hollow it left filled with new growth the way forests always do, without memory, without any marker. There is nothing there now to show what was found. The trees are old and very tall, and the light comes through them in the way it does in old forests, in long beams, at angles making everything beneath seem slightly separated from the world outside. Prince Emilio and Princess Irenaea lie in the Cathedral of St. Alda. Their names are carved in stone above the place where they were buried. The inscription gives their names and their dates and nothing else. None of the usual royal titles. None of the language of royal families and legacy. Just the names. Just the dates, the letters in the royal archive. It has been studied by many scholars over the years, photographed, copied, debated. The debate centers mostly on the phrase, "the one who serves the old house," who it referred to, whether it was Ferrante or someone else, whether the prince had been naming a specific person or speaking more generally about a system that had closed around him before he fully understood its shape. The scholars who have written about this case tend to focus on different things depending on what they study. Political historians write about inheritance law and the instabilities of competing claims to power. Social historians write about the position of women in arranged marriages of the time and what it means that Irenaea, whose own understanding of the situation we can only guess at, whose voice appears nowhere in any surviving document, was removed from history alongside her husband, caught in a calculation she had not been part of. Scholars of crime and justice write about the investigation, about the way official inquiries can be made to look thorough while being designed to avoid the truth. They all write eventually about the letter, about a young man sitting alone in a room 10 days before his wedding, writing words he perhaps did not expect anyone to ever read. Perhaps writing them simply because he needed to. Because putting a fear into words is sometimes the only thing a person can do when the fear is too big, and the choices are too few, and the night is very still. I trust no one. 3 words at the bottom of a page, the handwriting pressed harder than the rest, as though the pen needed to make something real by the force of pressing it into the surface. He had been right to be afraid. He had been wrong to think that writing it down would help. And he had been right. In a way he could not have known at the time to write it anyway, because the paper survived. The box was well made and the clay was cold and the tree eventually fell, as all trees. Teresa and a woodcutter named Marco was in the forest on an ordinary autumn morning with no expectation of finding anything except what he had come to find. The truth did not come quickly. It did not come cleanly. It came the way most truths come, sideways, by accident 20 years too late to save anyone, accompanied by the particular silence of those who would have preferred it had not come at all. But it came. It is the nature of buried things to eventually surface. Not because the world is fair, and not because the dead are owed anything by the living, simply because the earth shifts, because trees fall, because an old woman in a convent reaches the limit of what she is willing to carry to her grave. Because someone buries a box and cannot quite bring themselves to bury it deep enough. The roots go down a long way, but nothing stays buried forever.